Welcome to Storytelling with Data, the podcast where listeners around the world learn to be better storytellers and presenters with best-selling author, speaker, and workshop guru Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. We'll cover a wide range of topics that will help you effectively show and tell your data stories. So get ready to separate yourself from the mess of 3D exploding pie charts and deliver knockout presentations. And with that, here's Cole.
Hi, this is Cole, and I am here today with Jon Schwabish. Jon, hello.
Hi, Cole.
Jon is author of Better Presentations, editor of an upcoming book, Elevate the Debate. He's an economist specializing in data visualization and presentation at the Urban Institute, and a good friend of mine. Jon, I can't believe that we actually haven't sat down together and done this before.
We haven't done this before, and in person.
Yeah.
Like if we were to do it, we'd probably be on the phone or some sort of online Skyping situation, but in person.
Yeah, in person, so much more fun. So
It's
for
way more fun.
those listening, we are at the Urban Institute in DC in this actually super fun recording sort of studio deal.
Our own recording studio. We have our own podcast. We do lots of videos. So we have in our brand new building, we have this put in purposefully. Because at our last building, it was more like a closet that we sort of like.
Sounds like my normal
Right,
podcasting place.
exactly. Like egg cartons on the wall.
Yeah.
And this is an actual studio. So yeah.
Yes, well, it's very nice. I was trying to think as I was prepping for our conversation today of when we met. And I can remember where we met. I'll be curious if you remember this as well.
Interesting. So it was definitely in DC.
Yes.
We went to some restaurant.
Do you remember the theme of the restaurant?
It was some sort of like pig, pork, meat restaurant.
I think they actually only served pig at the restaurant.
Wow. How times have changed.
And I think it must have been, I couldn't figure out the date exactly, but this was like circa 2012, 2013.
Yeah, that sounds right. But why? I don't remember why we ended up meeting up.
I was in town doing some sort of work, and I think I must have had a public workshop then, because I think that you reached out and said, hey, saw you're going to be in town. We should get together because we'll have things that we want to talk about.
That sounds very much like what I would do, especially around that time, because that's when I was sort of just getting into this field. And I met Kim Reese outside where I used to work at the Congressional Budget Office. And I said, let's just grab coffee. And I had attended an Andy Kirk workshop in town. And little did I know that the woman I had lunch with during the lunch break was Anne Emery. And I didn't know that at the time. Like, all these connections.
Later, right?
Right. So, okay. So good. So we're thinking 2012.
Yeah, I think so.
It's a good long time.
I remember, and I don't remember if it was that conversation or if it was a separate instance, but I remember at one point you saying, wouldn't it be fun to write a book? But I don't want to write a book by myself. If I write a book, I want someone to write a book with. Do you maybe want to write a book at some point? Because a book is going to be too much work. Fast forward to today, you have a book, Better Presentations, that came out, was it last year? Was that
2016?
2016 already. Okay.
Yeah.
So 2016, you have Elevate the Debate, which you're editing, which is coming out
Comes out in January.
Yeah. What changed, right? How did you get from a book's too much work to having a couple going on now?
Well, what happened was I wrote an article for the Journal of Economic Perspectives as an economist doing data visualization. I was asked to write an article about data visualization. So I think the name of it is An Economist's Guide to Data Visualization. So I wrote that article, not an article that you would see quite often in the economics literature. Following that, I got a call from Columbia University.
What sort of things did you cover in the article?
So it's pretty much your basic introductory stuff, which I still teach and use today. So I follow these three guidelines or principles that I like to use that I talk about in Better Presentations in the chapter on data viz. But it's simple things like make sure you're showing your data, make sure you're getting rid of all the clutter, make sure you're integrating the text with the graphics so that things are holding together. So it was pretty much like an intro primer to data viz, but it used a lot of examples from the economics literature. So I was really trying to meet people where they are in that field.
Sure.
So then Columbia reached out and they said, oh, we saw your article. Would you like to write a data visualization book? And I said, no, I don't really know if I am ready for that. And I wasn't really sure.
When would this have been roughly time-wise?
So I think this was the article came out in 2014. So it was probably late 2014, early 2015.
Okay.
And at the time, I don't think your book was out yet, but I think you were working on your book.
Yeah, mine came out fall 2015.
Right. So I think you were working on your book.
Yep.
I think Andy Kirk was
Yeah,
working on his book. There were a whole bunch of books in the works that I knew about, and I didn't feel like I was quite ready. I didn't have the bandwidth, I don't think, at the time.
Yeah.
And I wasn't ready to write that book because I think I was still a little bit in my head trying to figure out my own perspective on things. And also, how do you write a data viz book without talking about tools, which I've since figured out how to do. And I think it's in many cases, the right way to do. Like your book and Andy's book, is just two examples, they're tool agnostic, which I think is the way you have to do these general educational books. You have to be tool agnostic. So I said, I don't really think I'm ready to write a data viz book, but I really want to write a book on presentation skills because there is an opening in the market. I saw more of an opening in the market to write something that would help people that do the kind of work that I do, do a better job talking. And so that's how that book came about. And
so you basically repitched what they came to you with to say,
I repitched.
not that one, let's do this.
They said, that sounds good, but since you have an idea, you need to now propose that to us as opposed to us just saying yes. So I proposed that to them, and my editor was
What
great.
was the level of detail there? Had you already sort of figured out your structure?
Yeah, I already had it in my head because I have, I'd been teaching a few workshops in presentation skills, and the workshop basically tried to take people from the beginning to the end of the presentation process. Okay. So let's write an outline, right? Let's think about what our goals are with the talk, what we want to say, what are the sections, right? Let's actually not just boot up PowerPoint or Keynote or whatever and start typing. Let's formulate an idea, right? Similar to what you talk about in both of your books on data viz. Then the second part is, okay, let's make this, if we need to, let's make the slides, let's pick the right images. Let's not use bullet points. Let's figure out some other ways. And then the last part of the book is let's actually give the presentation. So what are the techniques and strategies and tools we need to give a good presentation? So that was the workshop. And I felt more so than I did with data viz at the time that would lend itself really well to a book because there's 3 parts. They're all sort of self-contained, and I could meet people where they are because I'm not a designer. So when I talk about making good, well-designed slides, I'm not really thinking like a designer, right? I'm not opening Illustrator or Photoshop. I'm thinking like an economist who's presenting a research paper on food stamp participation or disability insurance. So how do I get images and graphs that match the content? So it felt more natural to me. And I was fortunate enough to find an editor who kept me on track. So I would sort of veer off into these little areas of like, well, I should talk about this whole line of things. Should be like, no, nobody cares about like going in depth on color theory. Like keep it short, keep it sweet. So it was actually turned out to be a really great experience, and it helped. As I'm sure you found, it informs the teaching. Absolutely. As you're writing things down, you're like, oh, okay, I really need to.
Well, and in both directions, right? Because once you've taught for a bit, then the writing becomes in many ways easier because you've already said these words or words like these before.
And you have that actual, like, the right sentence that really conveys that complex idea in a sort of concise way. And then you sort of take what you're working on in the writing, you implement it into the teaching, and then you come back to the writing again and say, okay, so this that I thought was going to work well, sort of, I need to break this up, expand it a little bit. So but at the time I wasn't really ready to write that data viz book, but the presentation book felt great. And I feel like I felt like that book really said what I wanted to say.
And who did you want to say it to? Who's the intended audience?
So the intended audience.
And say your subtitle for me, because I think that gets a part of it.
What is the subtitle? I'm blanking. So it's you have it. You have it. So I don't have to remember it. So it's Better Presentations, a guide for scholars, researchers, and wonks, which took a long time to get to, by the way. So we started with Better Presentations. Yeah. We went through this whole thing. I always think about do you remember that movie Julie and Julia?
Yeah.
Where there's a whole part about like taping the little cards on the wall to figure out the name of the book.
Okay.
It's kind of how I ended up with taping names on words and trying to do word association. But anyway, that's an aside. The book is really geared towards the kind of people that I work with here at Urban, right? It's geared towards people who work with data, who do sophisticated analysis, who need to take that analysis and they need to communicate it either to other researchers for different reasons. You might just be furthering the field, or you might be sharing data, you might be asking for more data, whatever it is. But you're also talking to foundations, for example. You might be talking to funders. You're also talking to stakeholders and policymakers and thought leaders. And so, one of the things that happened to me when I moved to urban was I came from government, where most of my peers were presenting at academic conferences. So it's a very specific niche way to go, right? The director is the only one who really talks to Congress, right? I come to urban, and it's a world where we have to, we're doing more. In some ways, we're doing more to pitch our work to policymakers and stakeholders. So I came fairly naively to the Urban Institute thinking that people are good presenters because this is what they do. They have to sort of go out and sell the ideas. But it turns out that researchers at Urban are just like researchers at CBO, that like we're in the data and not so much thinking about the communication side of things. So I spent a lot of time here talking to those types of people to basically make the case that, more or less saying, as a researcher, I know you don't think of yourself like a marketer or someone who's selling a product, right? You're not selling widgets, you're not selling iPhones, but you are selling ideas, right? And so that's the thing, that's the way you need to start thinking when you're presenting.
And that was going to be my next question, because that is the thing, right? I think for a lot of people listening, they get it, right? That you need to be able to communicate what you've done in order for what you've done to promote action or derive some sort of value from it. But in like, how do you, when you've got resistance, right? So take Urban, for example, here, how do you get people to want to spend time on that part?
Well, part of it is to get people to recognize that it's a learned skill. Yep. It's like everything else. It's the same with data storytelling, same with data visualization. It's not like we're born knowing how to read and make bar charts. We have to learn that. Same thing with presentations. You need to show people that there is a better way. You demonstrate how you can go about doing that, and you show them a couple of things. One, they don't have to do it all on their own. We have a fairly large communications department here. Part of my job is to help people do a better job with their slides. And two, it's really not that hard, right? To say, look, instead of having this slide, let's take a simple example. Instead of having this slide with 5 bullet points on it, let's make, instead of one slide, let's make it 5 slides. So you haven't really changed anything inherent. I mean, you and I do this sort of thing all the time, right? It's the same slide at the end of the day, but you've just broken it up. It's easier for the audience. Now we can take it a step further. Let's, instead of having 5 separate sentences, let's put a picture instead, or a graph instead of those 5 points. And what often happens for presenters is they use those 5 bullet points, those 5 sentences, as a crutch to make sure that they remember to talk about. It's a teleprompter, right? To remember those 5 things. Whereas if you encourage them and show them how to practice and how to make better slides, as they practice, they then don't need that crutch as much, because they are now more familiar with the content in the way in which they present it, which is very different than how they write it in the report. So for me, convincing researchers how to do a better job, a lot of it is demonstration and evidence to say, look at this person, your colleague here, who believes in doing this as a better job. Look how she went out in front of Senator so-and-so or this member of Congress, and those people bought into these ideas. It's not only because of the presentation, obviously, right? The content is the primary thing. But
is the content the primary thing, though? Because this has been an interesting thing for me, right? Because if you take a presentation that's being given live, there is the content, but then there's also the delivery.
Yeah. So it's a true evaluation that you'd want to do, right? So you have the same exact content, a good presenter versus a bad presenter. And so
when you know how that's going to play
you know
out,
how that's going to get
right?
But then if you flip it around and you have a good presenter, 2 good presenters, one presenting good content versus bad content, right? So I think it is still content, content is still king, because even if I give a great presentation, but I'm telling you something that doesn't make any sense.
But this is where it comes back to audience, right? And you talked about this and being specific about who is your audience out of these potential groups of audiences. Because if you can make it matter to them.
Absolutely. And so as a good example for like what we do here, right? If I need to go raise money for a project, or if I'm going to try to convince, say, a local government that they should spend money on such and such a program. If I go to them and I have a proposal for a program that costs $10 million and their annual budget is $1 million, right? I'm not going to where they are, right? So it absolutely matters, and always thinking about that audience. But for researchers, it's about convincing them that they can do it.
Yep.
It is going to take more time to get it right, but it's not going to be, double the amount of time that you spend on the entire project. and to demonstrate that there is a return on investment to it. And I think actually one thing that I've seen is that it's easier in some ways to demonstrate the ROI for data viz than it is for presentations.
Oh, I think it's tough in both cases. Right?
No, it's tough, but if you think about it, if
Yeah.
I post a data viz in a blog or just on its own, and I get a lot of Twitter likes and traffic, and there's a lot of web hits on it, that's sort of a quantifiable, measurable thing.
Mm-hmm.
When I give a good presentation, there's in some ways less of that. You might get people come up and say, "Oh, great job," or "I really learned a lot." But I think it's a little bit harder to demonstrate the ROI in the presentation side of things, which is why the evidence I think is still harder to come by. It's harder to say, "Look, I gave a great presentation, and therefore I got the grant, or the policymaker took this project up." Whereas someone could say, "Yeah, but the content was really good, so it was going to go it was going to be taken up anyways."
Interesting, because it's interesting because you frame the lessons in the book and when we're speaking as primarily being aimed at researchers, right? Because that's who you work with primarily. Right. But all of the things that you cover in the book, which I recommend frequently, it's the same in the business world. Right. And if it's an analyst needing to communicate or a manager needing to communicate, that it's these same sort of things that people are struggling with.
Yeah, except for like the one part of the book where I have I talk about a table of regression results. That's the one part of the book where I'm like, yeah, this is for a very specific audience right here.
Yeah, but there will be those audience. Yeah. There's the niches for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But what about for someone who they are going to start a presentation tomorrow? Mm-hmm. Where should they start? What's the first step?
So I think the first step is to not do what they probably do, which is to open PowerPoint or whatever their tool is, software tool, and start copying over topic sentences and copying and pasting graphs and figures and pictures and whatever it is, but instead to sit down with a piece of paper and a pen or Microsoft Word or Pine or whatever their tool is, and to write the outline for the talk, right? What do you want to say? What do you want people to do with it? So I have a little worksheet that I still use, that I designed for myself, is like a 2-page worksheet that it forces me to answer some key questions. Like, what is the headline? What do I want people to do? What is the opening paragraph of the talk? What is the closing paragraph? It's just simple things, but what it does is it forces me to be strategic and purposeful and in some ways cautious about what I want people to do with the talk. Because, trying to get a policymaker to adopt a policy is a very different audience and a type of talk than if I'm talking at an academic conference and I want people to see the work that I'm doing and I want to further the field in some particular way. It's very different. So we're all taught in grade school how to write a book report, and we're not taught to read the book and start writing. We have to write an outline. And yet, as we grow up, we get away from outlines as we write.
Well, because it almost feels like it's more efficient when we start with our tools,
right.
Which is
let's dive in and get listed. Yeah. And it's also kind of, in some ways, it's the fun part, right? Like you've had this 50-page paper. Let me turn it into 10 slides, which is not as much, and I can just start hacking away at all the words and the graphs. But it turns out that is not the way that we're going to create effective presentations, because what it's doing in that workflow where we take a report and basically convert it to slides is that we end up treating the slides as basically a shorter document. Mm-hmm. And what I say throughout the book over and over again, and it's sort of like a mantra I use in my workshops, is a presentation is a fundamentally different form of communication than a written report. Yep. And if you can get that into your head, that it's just fundamentally different, then you approach it in a different way. And if you approach it from the perspective of the audience, as opposed to from the presenter's perspective, you think of everything in a different way. We've all been members of an audience, and we've all seen bad talks, and yet we repeat a lot of those mistakes over and over again. So
what are some of those mistakes?
Okay, let's see. So we have all the text on the slide. We've
teleprompter,
teleprompter of text. We've got
fillers.
filler words, filler phrases too. Filler phrases too.
Yes.
Right? The essentially, statistically speaking. What else do we have? We have using things that are barriers, physical barriers between us and the audience. So I don't like to use podiums, especially with the podium where your computer is on top of the podium.
And you're standing behind it.
You're standing behind this.
You're tall enough that you can probably get away with it. Yeah. My face would get blocked.
There's this huge pillar. I think we have when it comes to slide design, I always feel bad when someone's put a picture up that they've clearly stolen. It has like the Shutterstock watermark and it's stretched.
And actually, that was one of the, for me personally, that was one of the most valuable sections in your book, was where to go to get good images. And have been guilty of some of the things that you downshot in that section. So I learned a bit there.
Yeah, that one, that's the one that makes me the most sad, I think, is like, like you really like that picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. And that's what you had to settle on, whatever came up in Google, right? Which is the other thing with respect to tools. It's maybe the only tool we'll talk about, but like the recommendation I have for lots of people is not to use Google as your image source. Mm-hmm. It's good to do your sort of basic search, which I also would encourage people to not start there. So if you're looking for an image that shows, economic growth, right? You type that into, type growth into Google, you're gonna get pictures of plants and trees and probably some 3D bar charts or something, right? Sure. Yeah. But to think about what you want the picture to be and then go find it. But the thing about Google is that it's not particularly great at recognizing who owns what photograph. Right. So if you put that photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge up on your site and it's a picture you took, you own it. If I steal it from you and I put it on my website and then someone Googles Golden Gate Bridge and they grab the one that I stole from you, they're not off the hook. And Google's not great at discerning those two photographs.
Well, and I think Google just has a standard, like there may be copyright.
Right. It's sort of like and it has it has a filter for copyright, but it, if I don't tag it on my site, then it doesn't really know.
So where should people go?
So my favorite site is one called Unsplash. So it's like splash in a pool, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the origin of that term, which would be interesting. Mm-hmm. But the reason I like Unsplash the most is all the photos on the site are very large and they're very high quality. And they're also tagged as a license is CC0 or Creative Commons 0, which means you can do anything you want with those photographs without having to pay, without having to add attribution. I usually add attribution just because it's nice.
You're a nice guy.
Yeah. Well, you try to give people some credit, but it's also, the library is growing very quickly. So now you'll see like NASA has their photos go onto Unsplash. So NASA photos are in the public domain in the US, so you can use those for whatever. So I like Unsplash. There's ones that are similar to that, like Pexels and Pixabay, similar sort of Creative Commons 0, where you can just grab them and you want to make t-shirts out of those pictures and sell them, you can do that. Then there are the paid sites like Shutterstock and iStock and Corbis and Getty. Of course, now you're paying for things. Yep. I like the free stuff. It's why my wife doesn't let me take the kids to the auto show anymore, because I come back with all the free frisbees and keychains and stuff. But
wasn't sure where you were going with that.
Yeah, because I buy a big BMW. Right? So I like those three sites in particular are my favorites. I mean, you can go to Flickr, and there's a related site there's one called Morguefile, and there's another one that I am blanking on the name right now. But if you go to Flickr, you can search through their API, you can search through their library, and then you can also filter by the way people have tagged them. And the thing about Flickr is once you put a photo on there, it's actually, they automatically assign a Creative Commons license to everything, and you have to physically change it. So if someone hasn't thought about changing it, then you can go use it. So
other common mistakes, presentations?
Other common mistakes. Well, there's some that are rules, I'd say, that are meant to be broken. Okay. Like facing the screen is similar to like the podium, right? Or having a computer in front of you. However, there are always these talks like Hans Rosling's talk, his TED talk, right? He breaks all these quote unquote rules. Well,
because for me with the facing the screen, it comes down to how you're mic'd up. Because part of it, if you face the screen and people can't hear you, that's a problem.
Absolutely.
But if you can face the screen in a way that's preventing emphasis and people can still hear you.
Well, it's also, I think the most important thing is that you care about your content, right? So, the Hans Rosling talk, the famous Hans Rosling talk, he stands behind a computer for a bunch of it. He talks really fast. But he's so excited, right? He faces the screen and his hands are up in the air, but he's so excited. And so who cares, right? You have to care about the content, because if you don't care about
is that another place where the presentation of it overcomes
over the content?
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know.
Just putting it
Well, I think the enthusiasm for the content
that's
is in some ways separate,
right? Because if you don't care about your topic, there's no way you're going to make anyone else care about your topic.
If you don't care about it, then there's no reason anyone else should care about it, which I know is hard to do, especially for researchers who are showing like It's hard to talk about econometric theory.
Well, no, but if this is something they've been living and breathing
Right,
for
yeah,
how
yeah.
long,
But it's and it's how do you get people to come to your side? How do you get them to
Yes.
buy in your ideas, right? Even though what you might be presenting on like healthcare cost projections may not be the most exciting content in the world,
Yeah.
but you have been working on it and you have decided that it's important enough to spend time working on it. Therefore, you should be excited about it. And if you're not, then no one else is going to be excited about it.
Yeah.
This is a minor thing, but I have seen a lot of people do this, is when you're presenting, take stuff out of your pockets. Maybe this is more for men, maybe, because we have.
That's a good tip.
we have
Yeah,
more-
probably more for men where you get the bulky.
We have, and we also have
yeah.
bigger pockets, as we
Yes.
learned from the puddings
Yes.
piece a few years ago. I had a professor in graduate school who had like a phone, and I'm talking like this is early 2000s, so like
A big
big phone, yeah, and keys and change, and like you could hear as he walked, like everything would jingle around. So minor stuff like that, like to get rid of that stuff. The other one that comes to mind, we were talking about microphones earlier before we came on, as we were getting set up for lavalier mics, where you have the little battery pack that connects to a wire and connects to a clip. For men, that's usually pretty easy. If we were in a button-down shirt, we just clip it right there. For women,
it can get a little tricky. There's like, you need a pocket, or you need a belt, or you need something to. Otherwise, they end up like clipping it to the back of a dress.
Right. Or you're holding it, and sort of defeats the whole purpose. Yeah. I think for me, it's things, and I think I follow the same approach a little bit in my data viz. It's things that distract people from getting to your core message, right? And you talk about this all the time on your blog, right? That here's this bar chart. It doesn't take a lot to take a simple bar chart to make it just better, right? You spend a lot of time like stripping out grid lines and axes and data markers and data labels and make the title active and all that stuff, right? A lot of it's really not rocket science. It's just thinking about how do I get people as quickly as possible to compare the first bar to the last bar, and that's it.
Yep.
Same thing with presentations. How do you get people to see that this is the core part of your idea, instead of forcing them to read this thing as if they're reading a report?
Well, and for you as the presenter of the material to be assisting in that, not inhibiting that in any way, right? Which comes back to these distractions.
Right. So
whether it's fillers or phones in the pocket.
I think we think as humans, we're all really good multitaskers, but we know like that's not how our brains actually work. Like we're bad multitaskers, right? It's why we should not text and drive. It's like my one safety message to your listeners, right? Don't text and drive, right? Yeah. We're really bad at multitasking. And so when you ask people to look at the screen and read and listen to you talk simultaneously, they're not getting the information you want them to get.
And what about, so I feel like a lot of what we've talked about has been framed in you're standing on a stage, you're mic'd up, you are giving a presentation with a capital P. What about more informally, right? I'm in an office with my colleagues and I'm presenting something. What if the stuff that we've talked about, what carries over and what are different things that we should be considering?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I think we can think of this in maybe even finer, narrower terms, because the way I think about it, right, is like a department seminar where it is a presentation, but maybe there's 10, 15, 20 people in the room. But we can even think about a smaller group, there's 6 of us and we're sitting at a table and maybe there's a TV or there's a computer screen we're looking at. I would say, at least in that last case, that latter case of there's a very small group of us. In that case, you might be better off actually having physical handouts where we're actually going to work on paper together, as opposed to me putting something on a screen.
I don't know. You say that, and I just
you don't like paper?
Cringe. No, because as soon as you hand something to someone, they can start flipping through it, and
right,
now
but
you've lost control over the.
But we're at this table. But what if we have 4 people around this table and we're working through some?
Yes,
so that's what I'm. Yeah. So we're sort of working through something. So I guess Nancy Duarte, who has these great books, Resonate, and there's the new one, Data Story. She was on your show, right? She makes this really good differentiation between a presentation that you are intending to convince someone of some case or argument, and a presentation that's more of a meeting where you're working together to come to a solution or some agreement. And those are 2 very different things. And so when I think about the 4 people here sitting around a table, I'm thinking about this scenario in which we're working together towards an outcome. Different from that department seminar where I'm saying, here's the thing I want you to buy into. I want you to listen to, agree with. So I would agree in those cases, like my strategy is when I go into a department seminar type of room where someone's printed out their slides, which is like the worst, I sit in the back of the room and I just wait. And I watch how long does it take the majority of people to start flipping through the slides.
Yeah, whether you've lost them, right?
Like
as the
not even 5 minutes. Even if it's a good presentation, you're right, it's in people's hands and they're going to start flipping through them. So I think the other point to make is that every meeting you have is a presentation, right? So I have a colleague at my former office, and she's a senior manager there, and she has lots of more of the junior staff come in. They'll call for a meeting with her and say, I want to talk to you about this project. And they'll sit down and she'll say, okay, what's the question? What are the issues? And they'll sort of stumble and stammer. And it is a presentation, right? Especially with a senior manager or boss or whatever, CEO, right? Like you need to prepare for those. It is just like practicing your talk in front of 1,000 people if you're presenting.
Well, and that's the chance to practice and hone those skills.
That's right. Yep. So I think, in some ways, everything is a presentation. Everything is a chance to practice and to hone your ideas and get to the core of the idea. It's one of the things that, I spend a lot of time talking about, especially to folks here at Urban and other places that are similar in that researchy vein, is that we're not dumbing things down, right? We're not talking, sometimes we're talking to non-specialists, but it's not about dumbing it down. It's about what is the core thing? What is the core of the idea that you want to convey to people? And let's get to that core idea and then let's go from there.
Yeah, and actually, maybe this is a good pivot point to talk a little bit more about Elevate the Debate, the book that you've edited that's coming out in January. So one of the things, I haven't had a chance to read it, but have had some snippets of it, but one of the things that you cover in the book is the pyramid philosophy. Can you talk to us about what that is and how to use it?
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about the book so people get a sense. So the Urban Institute is almost 500 people, mostly researchers, sociologists, economists, demographers, political scientists. We have a communications team of about 50 people. Some of those members of the communications team sit in some of the 10 different centers that we have. So they're sort of the conduit between the communications efforts for, say, in our justice group with the communications team. So we had done a series of workshops from our communications team for a number of different groups. Some social workers, some people working on housing discrimination. And so we did these full day workshops to help them do a better job communicating. So I would teach a little hour on data viz, and someone would teach an hour on how to write blog posts, and someone would spend half hour showing people how to use Twitter, right? Because if you've never done it before, right, can be overwhelming. So you have to these are all learned skills.
Well, and it's different, I think, in a professional setting versus a personal.
Right, exactly. Like Facebook, most people use Facebook,
most people our age use Facebook.
All right, yeah.
I don't know.
But it's friends and family, right? It's not professional. Whereas if you're going into LinkedIn or Twitter, you're probably, if you want to use it professionally, it's different. So anyway, we did these series of workshops, and then we decided, well, we can help more people if we put all this down in writing. So we have this 8-chapter book, and each chapter deals with a different aspect of communicating data, communicating research, communicating analysis. So it's a chapter on data viz, a chapter on writing good blogs, a chapter on how do you talk to reporters, chapter on how
each written by a different
member of our communications team. So there's a chapter on strategic planning. There's a chapter on social media techniques. So we have all these 8 chapters. And what drives the book, sort of the underlying philosophy, is this pyramid philosophy that you mentioned. So you have to imagine a pyramid, which is not.
We'll link to the visual of this in the show notes.
And it's not hard to imagine a pyramid. It's just a triangle. Okay, so imagine a triangle, and at the bottom of the triangle, we place the most technical, dense working paper, white paper.
So
right.
This is the base.
This is the base.
Okay.
So this has all the math. It has all the formulas, all the dense, gory detail. Okay, we work ourselves up just a little bit, and we get to peer-reviewed journal articles. So still a lot of math, still a lot of numbers, but maybe not as much because you don't need appendix 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then we go up a little bit further, and we have a fact sheet or an issue brief. So it's 5 pages or 2 pages. Then we have an op-ed, say in the Times or the Washington Post. Then we have convenings and meetings. And at the and then we have interviews. And at the very, very top, we have social media. So we have tweets, Facebook posts, what have you. Okay. So that's our first pyramid. So we go from the bottom is the most technical thing all the way up to the top, which is that sort of shortest core of the idea type thing.
Yep.
If you flip that pyramid upside down and put it right next to it, we call that the audience pyramid. So that's the size of your audience. So, and I don't think this is going to surprise anybody who's listening to this, the 6 people read the technical dense working paper, but more are going to read the fact sheet, more read the issue brief, even more read the blog posts, and hundreds, thousands, if you're lucky, tens of thousands or millions read the tweet. And so what we do is we pair these two together. And what the philosophy says here is that you are using social media, just as an example, to reach a lot more people. Yep. But it's all rooted all the way down in the dense, sophisticated, in-depth analysis.
Well, and that's the thing I really like about this, because back to your point on simplifying or it not being about oversimplifying, right? You get to the tweet, to the pithy thing, but it has this depth of analysis that has to happen before you can get there.
Right, exactly. And so what we talk about in the book is like, okay, yes, we have this tweet that says, check out, well, make it simple. Check out this report on, or this interactive data viz on criminal justice reform. Okay, so that's the tweet. So you click in the link and you get to an Urban page that has, maybe a long form, immersive sort of storytelling piece. There's an interactive map in there maybe that you can, look around through, whatever. We will sometimes have fact sheets. So we try to meet people in the local areas. So maybe we have, fact sheets for each of the 50 states, or it's the 3 cities that are in this study. And then at the very bottom, you can download the data, or you click and go to the 30, 50, 200 page report where, again, only a few people are going to get there, but those people are diving all the way into the nitty-gritty details. Yep. So where this philosophy really helps is back to what we were talking about earlier, which is how do you convince researchers and people who are not used to thinking about how they talk to other people.
And I personally would expand this to sort of anybody in a technical role who is deep in their domain expertise and needs to communicate that to someone else.
Yeah. So how do you convince them that what we're talking about with communicating is not dumbing things down? Yep. It's not getting rid of the details and the subtlety and the nuance of all the data and all the research, because we're not getting rid of that. We're building on top of it. Yeah. So the social media tweet or Facebook post or your op-ed, it's not trying to ignore pieces of the research, but it's trying to reach a different audience, trying to reach them where they are. And if there are members of that audience that want to go into your math or the details, or whatever it is, it's going to root all the way back to that. So there's this base.
How do you actually use the pyramid? So are you coaching with researchers to help them understand, or is it something that's used more by the communications team when you're figuring out how to target different layers of communications?
It's a little bit of both. Yeah. So the way... So just one of the tools that we have here, we have on our internal intranet, when a researcher has a project that they're going to need communication support, they have to go in and fill out this form that says, okay, so who are your, and we ask some of the questions that we basically ask for, that I ask for presentations, right? Who is your audience? Who do you think is the most important people? And we sometimes ask for like specifics. Yeah. Is it the senator from Alabama that you want to like, who are they? And what do you think best meets the needs of that audience, and how can we get them? Then we'll sit down.
In terms of what sort of communication?
Right, and sort of what sort of communications. Then we identify the communications team. So maybe for one project, we need our design team and our data viz team and our blog team. But maybe for another project, we're not going to do a data viz. We need more of the editorial support, and we need the reporting team, because they're going to go out and reach those people. So we are trying to build these teams in a more strategic way, as opposed to let's just put it out and see what happens. And that's what I think happened early on as Urban, this is probably like 5, 6, 7 years ago, Urban sort of started rethinking its communication efforts. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that early work was, we have this great research. I think this happens with a lot of people. We have this great research. It's on criminal justice reform, and we've got great data and great ideas. Let's put out the paper. And then nothing really happens to it. And it's because you're not reaching people who need to get to it. So we have sort of now take a more strategic approach to this, where we are thinking about how do we specifically meet people where they are. And, I think a lot of people think, well, if this tweet could reach 5,000 people, right, that's what I want. I want to go viral. But the counterpoint to that is, do you need to reach 5,000 people, or is it the right 5 people?
Yeah,
and
exactly. Or the right one person.
Or the right one person, right?
Exactly.
And so, so if like, do you need to reach your colleagues, or do you just need to reach the CEO, right? And that's the person you really need to talk to, or the policymaker, or the funder, or whoever it is. So a lot of it is just like we were talking about earlier with presentations, is thinking strategically about where you want the research to go, who you want to reach with it, and what you want them to do with it at the end of the day.
So you've talked about the pyramid philosophy. Are there other foundational tools or concepts or case studies in Elevate the Debate? What other sort of content can people find there?
Yeah. So like I said, we have different chapters for each of these different components of good presentations, good communications. And then between each chapter, we have what we call case studies. So there's some study that we published or some event that we held or some outreach that we did at Urban that we had really good success with. So one of those short stories or case studies is our new education policy team. So I think now 2 years ago, we launched a new center that's education policy. And the person who heads that center, economist by the name of Matt Chingos, had recently wrote a book on student loans. So a lot of the work was coming out about student loans. And so as part of the effort to launch this new center, they didn't just say, we're going to do all education and we're going to reach everybody who's doing anything about education, right? We're going to start by focusing on student loans, on higher ed, and that's where we're going to start. And so what that team did is they built the center is they actually sat down with our outreach team. So we have 2 or 3 members of our outreach and government affairs team where they said, okay, so who do we want to make sure that your information is getting to those people? So you need to reach what's called the Health Education Labor Subcommittee, right? So how do we reach the department, the right people at the Department of Ed? How do we reach the right people with the work that you're doing? So it's more strategic than I think a lot of people think about, but it's also something that doesn't need a 50-person team. Mm-hmm. So the last chapter in the book is written by one of our strategic managers, Kate Villarreal, and what she talks about is it's another worksheet. Like a lot of the book is worksheets. Like, how do you sit down and be strategic about this? Like, sit down. What is your purpose? Who are you trying to reach? If you're doing a project on criminal justice reform in Houston, okay, so now you focused on Houston. So you're focusing on the mayor of Houston. You're focusing on return to work advocates in Houston, right? It's more sort of hyper local in that way. And you sit down and you be strategic about what you want people to do with the research and how you're going to go get it to them, right? So is it an op-ed? Is it a tweet? Is it a 30-page paper? Is it a 2-page fact sheet?
And
right?
what sort of, so if the person who's filling out the worksheet, say, if they have an idea of who they need to reach, but maybe not how or the best way,
right.
what do they do then?
So the previous 7 chapters of the book helps them get to this stage where now they can say, oh, okay, so now I know
so you gotta read the book to get the good stuff.
Yeah. So now I know how to. I've never been on Twitter before. Okay, so here's a whole chapter on how I should use Twitter. And my favorite part from the chapter on social media, and I thought this was really smart, is when you launch a Twitter page, as we talked about, a professional Twitter page, you might not want it to be, I think the one he uses in the book is Chubby Hubby 42. Like that's not a particularly, you don't really want to talk about tax reform under that handle, right? But the recommendation from our social media manager, Dave Connell, is don't just start following everybody and expect them to follow you back. You need to have a sort of library of content in your Twitter feed. So the story he tells in the book is, I get this newsletter from some organization that I follow, and the email says our CEO or president is going to join Twitter and follow this person for more information and get what we get. So Dave clicks the link, it goes to the Twitter page, and there's no content, there's no tweets. So Dave doesn't follow that person and never does. So instead of just launching into Twitter, build up sort of this library of content, as you will, and then people come to that page with
when
something
it doesn't
to
even need to all be original content, right?
No, exactly. It just be stuff that you're sharing, right? Exactly. I think, and rightfully so, a lot of people get turned off by social media, and I think there's a lot of reasons why, and there are a lot of issues with social media, especially when it comes to harassment and addiction and all of these things. And I think there's certainly issues with all of that. I mean, personally, my Twitter feed is generally a lovely place to be, but it's just our little community, right? Yeah. So let's see. Another example would be in the chapter on talking to reporters. I mean, I don't think I'd go out on a limb to say a lot of researchers are introverts and are not particularly comfortable talking to reporters. And I think a lot of people think that reporters are trying to burn them or get a gotcha question. And what our head of our media team has taught me, is, me in particular, and hopefully people who read the book, is that researchers are relying on the person they're interviewing for information.
Yep.
And for knowledge. And they're just trying to do their job of writing a story, and they want the content, and they want, good, smart people to talk to. So it's not about being scared of those people, but it is, it does take skill to be able to talk to reporters and know how to do that. The one, like, I'm sort of like telling you like my favorite parts, but the one thing that I took away from we do some trainings here, and it's in the book, obviously, is that when you do an interview for, say, a newspaper, the reporter almost always will ask at the very end of the interview, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Mm-hmm.
Right? They give you this little space at the end.
Yeah.
And the answer to that question is always yes. 100% of the time, you should say yes. And you can use that time to restate an answer, reframe something, because you've warmed up, you've gotten through the interview. Maybe you can say it in kind of a better way, or maybe there's something that you left out that you want to come back to. So the answer to that question is always yes. So these little
and that's
nuggets,
actually a place coming back to the pyramid. If you think about further up the pyramid, when you've got the pithy, so what,
Right.
like restate that.
Right,
then.
exactly, right. So you've got that, right? Because if you think about a newspaper article,
give them
they're
the
not-
headline.
Yeah, they're not quoting a paragraph of what you said. They want that little concise active phrase that really, like you said, that pithy statement that really gets to the core of it. Yeah.
Awesome. I want to shift gears
Okay.
because I put a note out to the Storytelling with Data community and said,
Right.
what questions do you have for Jon Schwabish?
Uh-oh.
And this brings us more back on the presentations
Okay.
side of things. Let's see. Allie had a good, simple question, which is, what do you think is the best way to begin a presentation? She says, I always feel stuck and unfortunately begin with, today I'm going to talk about.
So it's a great question. Thanks, Allie. Hi, Allie. I always like to start with what I am, what is my bottom line? So in my little worksheet we talked about earlier, I have a space in that where I actually write down my opening statement. So I don't memorize my talks. And I know you don't memorize your talks because it sounds stilted.
Well, and if you memorize, if you get off track, then you're like
totally lost,
and
right?
that
Because we're not
means
actors, right? But I do tend to memorize like the first 2 or 3 sentences, because what I've done is I've crafted that really carefully, because I want it to be concise. I want it to be, really active. And if I memorize it, I can really craft it carefully. And I also know the first moment and the last moment of the talk is when people pay the most attention, right? So I think a lot of people will say, thanks for having me. Great to be here. Like, that's like, don't start with that. And the one technique that I've recommended to people is, if your habit is to say, thank you for having me, I'm here to tell you about X, Y, and Z. Say that first phrase, thank you for having me, just in your head, and then start talking. So you say it, but no one will hear except for you, because that pause is fine at the very beginning.
Yes.
Pauses are very powerful, because you pause and everyone's like, oh, something's wrong. So instead of saying, today what I'm going to talk about this with you is, I think that the need for X, Y, and Z is really important. So I get right to what is the bottom line. And I try to be, right from the get-go, super enthusiastic, even maybe a little loud, especially if you're at like an academic conference, or even there's a lot of speakers. Like, you want something that grabs people's attention, right? So it's a great question, and it's the same thing for at the end. The other thing I'll say at the end, because this I've been trying to do this a little bit more. So at the end, same thing. You have maximum engagement. 2 points of maximum engagement at the very end. You want to end with that concise closing statement. And then a lot of times we have this like Q&A. It's like 10, 15 minutes or whatever it is of Q&A. The one thing that I've been trying to do more myself, and I've been trying to recommend it to people, is that have your closing statement ready to go again.
Yes.
So that, like, Cole, you have some question, I answer the question, and then usually people are like, all right, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
And you sort of end on this like down note, right? Whereas opposed to, thanks for your question, something along the lines of
leaving here today.
Yeah, right. Leaving here,
remember.
just to recast, or as you're, walking out the door, don't forget, whatever it is, you want to kind of get back up to that high point.
Well, and that's again where having that, knowing what that is ahead of time and having practiced it, and where you can hit the delivery of it can make a big difference.
But while we're here, so what do you do to start?
I am totally fine, and this was a developed comfort, I should say. I will stand awkwardly on the stage without saying anything until I have everyone's attention. and then I launch in.
Yeah.
And when it depends on the, the scenario and the audience. For anything big audiences,
Mhm.
because for me, you always see people get lost when someone introduces themselves.
Yes.
And so I don't introduce myself.
Yeah.
I skip over that entirely, and I
Right.
just launch into whatever the thing
Yeah.
is.
I often like to start with a story.
Mhm.
I have this story of Charles Schwab and his.
Oh, you have like a go-to.
I have like
story.
a go-to story.
Oh.
That Charles Schwab has a story he tells in his books about, basically improving one of the steel firms, steel plants, and how he used data to basically do that. I put up this one slide that's a picture of the steel mill, and I start with back in the early part of the 20th century, right? Like that's how the whole thing starts, right? So it's just starting with the story.
Yeah.
Because
how do you bring that back around? Because I haven't figured out the.
So I bring it back to in this case, like I bring it back to, because basically the story is I don't want to tell the whole story, but no, it's okay because the story.
Or how do you transition from the story
into the thing?
Comes next?
Because the story,
particularly if what comes next could be vastly different across presentations.
Well, that's okay. So so I don't use it all the time,
Okay.
but because it's relevant to visualizing data. And the way that this story ends is essentially Schwab writes the number of units of steel that this mill created over the course of the day. I make the case that when you are visualizing your data, it doesn't have to be the most complex thing. It can be a simple number, right? And then launching into, okay, so how can we build up from that? Maybe that's like one of the most simple visualizations you can create is the number 6, right? So how do we build up from there and do it in a smart, effective way?
Yeah, well, and that's smart, right? Of building people's anticipation and their wanting to know how it's going to become
end,
relevant.
Right? Yeah,
and how
exactly.
You're bring it back.
So, how is this story going to end? And why do I care about Charles Schwab? Right?
Yep. Yeah. So a related question on exposition. Copley, which I might be saying incorrectly, and I apologize if so, asks, typically I format presentations with some sort of exposition. Tell them what you're going to tell them, body, tell them, and recap, tell them what you told them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips for creating that exposition piece? I often get so caught up on what to say in that slide that I sometimes miss the point.
So this is the middle slide on the content?
No, I think this is the beginning.
The beginning slide.
What you're going to tell them.
What you're going to tell them.
Laying out what is to come.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I like to show a picture that goes along with the story because it's not too much information. It's just the visual cue. I guess I would flip it around and say at the very end, what I do is I put, and I've done this at the beginning, but mostly at the end, is I put like the headline. Mm-hmm. So I've written down on that worksheet we talked about, I've written down my headline for the whole talk. You should do X, Y, and Z to cut down on homelessness in your city.
And this is what you launch into at the beginning.
This is what I launch into. And then I'm going to use that same sentence on its own slide at the very end, instead of what, especially in research, what people do is they write questions, question mark, right? Or thank you, exclamation point, right? Or thank you, comma, questions, right? So at the very end, at least, I like to have that thing, that statement up there. And a lot of academic conferences, there's, a good maybe 20, 30 minutes of questions that, can be for the whole panel. So I love to go last because, hey, my sentence sits up there for 20 minutes. Yep. But to the point of the questioner's point, I think if you can sit down and really think about what is the core of the idea, like if you had to write a tweet about your 60-minute presentation of your 200-page paper, what would the tweet be? Maybe not even 200, what do we got, 280 characters now? 240, however many characters we're allowed to use with links and all and emojis and all that. Like even shorter than that, but like what is the tweet that you would use? And that's where you can start to build up from there. And maybe that's how you start with this launching into the exposition. But I really like to start with stories because as you said, and as you've written about, right, there is an arc to stories and there's an anticipation to how this is going to turn out. And if you tell a story that is seemingly, at least at the start, irrelevant to your content, you've really grabbed people's attention. Because I start this whole story with, in the early part of the 20th century, Charles Schwab was a steel magnate. He owned steel mills all around the country.
People are thinking they've shown up to the wrong presentation.
Yeah, they're like, what is this guy talking about? Like, this is not data viz. And then you hook it back.
Yep.
And then they see the relevance. And then you can move from there.
Augusto asks, what is the last tweak you usually make in a presentation? I thought this was a fun one.
That is a fun one. The last tweak I usually make. There's probably two.
You can have two.
I can have two. Okay. So I think there's definitely two. So on my beginning or ending slide, I'll use the beginning slide. There's like the title, and there'll be my name and usually Twitter handle. And I think for whatever reason, every time I go back to the slide and look at that, I want to adjust the spacing. Like I haven't quite got it just right. But I think more often than not, there'll usually be a picture or an image with text on it or around it or something. And I'm not always 100% satisfied with how it lays out on the picture, right? So when I'm looking for pictures in my slides, I'm looking for blurry areas or transitions or white space. But sometimes if you like think about a picture of a city where you have like the buildings at the bottom part and then maybe it transitions to like a blue sky at the top, and the blue sky stretches across the entire width of the slide. So it's easy to put text there. But that's like the rare occasion. Usually it's like there's this little like corner of the slide where you have like blank space. And so I think the last tweaks I usually make is to go back to those, make sure, okay,
So you're rearranging elements.
I'm doing these like little fine tuning. Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit I think it's definitely like the last things are the fine tuning. And then if I'm really like have a little more time, maybe I'm thinking about, should I add a little animation to this? Like, I don't use a lot of animations on my slides, but I've been using a little bit more of the softer animations and transitions to sort of soften the slide 1 to slide 2 is like, here's 1, here's 2, as maybe I do like more of a softer like fade into slide 2. And I will use those in careful ways where I want someone to be able to see that I am doing this transition from one thought to the next. So it's a careful, strategic way as opposed to like, I'm not using blinds or swirly stuff or anything like that, right?
No flying, jumping.
Yeah.
All right. I want to try something new next. And you mentioned this earlier, this idea of word association, right? Because there are a few things that I think would be fun to just sort of rapid fire at you. But what I want to know is, do you love it? Do you hate it? And what tips do you have for folks on how do you be effective with the thing? And this will make more sense once I tell you.
So it's love it or hate it to start.
Love it or hate it.
Okay.
And then what tip do you have that you might want to share related to it?
All right.
So first off, pre-reads.
Okay, so because I think we have discovered in this conversation is that we deal with sometimes different audiences.
Yes.
So I want you to define pre-reads.
So pre-read, the way I would define it is something you need to send around to your audience before you have the presentation. And let's assume, based on your definitions, this is your, where you show up to your sort of seminar, you're going to talk to your colleagues about something.
Oh, see,
pre-reads, love it, hate it.
Oh, you're
tips on being successful.
You're making so I'm gonna say, love it with a caveat.
Okay. I hate them, by the way.
You hate them.
Yeah, but that's
okay. So, well, this is good. I'm going to enjoy this. So, I have the caveat because there are different audiences and scenarios.
Yes.
So, I would say for meetings, for your sort of general meeting, I love them because I want the meeting to be. We should be having the meeting for a purpose, and we should be getting to some answer. And if we're spending our meeting reading something that we should already know,
so you like it from the efficiency
standpoint. From the efficiency standpoint, right? Yep. And I would say I like it in the case where I'm presenting, say, an academic paper, which is usually the way, especially economics, or at least economics works. There's a written paper, people go through, and then there's a presentation. And the reason that works really well is because the presenter then doesn't necessarily need to go through all the detail of the math, right? So in general, I love them.
What tips do you have for people being successful with them?
Let's talk about the meeting one, because that's kind of the more fun one in some ways. I think the thing that we just don't do in general, the world maybe, is we're just not thinking about people's time. We have a 30-minute meeting and we're going to spend half of that time, and we need to come to a decision. We're going to spend half of that time talking about
things that people could read.
Right, things that people could read, right? And if you think about, and yes, people have to read the thing on their own.
And that's why I hate them.
And that's because they're not going to do it. But
or no, some do and some don't, and then you've got this really mixed
field. So then is it a problem with the pre-read itself, or is that a culture problem that people aren't expected to read it? Similar, why do meetings start 5 or 10 minutes late, like all the time?
Yeah.
Because it's part of the culture, right? And so I think and there's a transition to get from a place where our meetings start 10 minutes late, and we read, we go through the kind we should be reading, and so we're being inefficient, to a place where people are reading stuff before they get there, and we're spending 30 minutes, I was gonna say arguing, but discussing
Productive.
the productive content. And I don't exactly know how to change that culture. I think one way is to try to price it out, right? Because you say there's 10 people in this meeting. Okay?
Oh, to actually
every person makes.
You really mean put dollars?
Yeah,
on
put
it.
dollars because every person makes X dollars a year plus their benefits, divided by 2,000 hours, right? And this is how much it makes. Each person here makes per hour. So this meeting is costing us $5,000.
Interesting. All right. Next rapid fire.
Okay. That wasn't so rapid, by the way.
No, it wasn't rapid at all. It's not going to be.
Okay.
We're both too verbose. I think I know which direction you're going to go with this. So I'm going to throw it out anyway. Presentation templates.
I hate them.
Really?
Yeah.
That's not where I thought you would go.
No,
aren't you in the process of redesigning a presentation template?
Well, yes, but God, see again, I have to put a caveat on
That's
it.
okay.
Like, I think when you say template, I think of these websites where I like download this whole thing.
Okay, let me actually totally reframe this and make it a style guide.
Okay, love them.
Okay.
Yeah. So I love this. I love style guides because, well, for many reasons, but one especially is that they reduce the barrier for a lot of people. So a lot of people say, I don't have time to think about how to make a new graph or a better slide because I have to worry about which line should be blue and which one should be black and which one should be yellow. And if you say to them, don't worry about it, we're going to make that decision for you and we're going to tell you what font you have to use and how big the chart should be.
But then, sorry, I have to butt in because why can't we then also have a presentation template that does all of that?
So that's why I originally said hate it because, you go to there's a lot of websites out there where you download these templates and they're sort of generic. It's like the default PowerPoint ones on steroids, as opposed to a template that's customized for your organization or company or whatever. Just one quick plug. So there's this book by Echo Swinford and Julie Terberg on designing PowerPoint templates that I think is like the best book. And one of the things that they talk about in the book is how, like, if you have a color palette, you can use the gray area outside the slide that you could put, for example, like the color palette for your, like, it's built in, but it's also sitting there so that people can use it. So I'm not being very good at this rapid fire.
It's okay. Failed experiment. It's
no,
still
but
fun.
it's still fun. It's still fun. So I think in general, I do like templates because it helps people. It helps people get over some of their wariness about being designers. They're not designers and they don't want to be designers, right? They just want to make a graph and move on to the next thing.
And so I find sometimes people crave rules and guidelines and it helps set.
It does. I mean, it does help, right? Like, I don't have to think about if I have an Excel template and I don't have to think about what size the title should be because you told me it's 16-point font and it's in Calibri or whatever it is, right?
And then it's consistent. And then if your slide has to be pulled in with a slide,
right, and you can recognize that report from that organization. It has that same feel, and I can and the person, you always hope. I mean, you know this, right? You always hope that people are going to spend time thinking about their graphs and thinking about their viz. But, most of them probably don't. And probably many of them, like the bar chart is fine. Like the bar chart.
There's nothing wrong with a bar chart.
No, I'm just saying, like, they don't need to think about, like, not even like a network diagram, like just, whatever, a heat map or sparkline. So it's a bar chart. That's all they need. And so you've taken this barrier down to be like, how do I make a good bar chart? It's a button. Don't worry about it. It's all going to be solved for you with the click of this button. So I generally like them, but there are the ones that are like on steroids that I don't like. So.
All right. One more of these.
Okay.
Resistant audiences.
Can I say I love them?
Yeah, I would say I love them.
I love them, right? Because you have to really work. To get them on your side. Yeah, it really does get exciting. Now, I will say there are oftentimes, it's not the audience that's resistant. There's like one person that's resistant.
And what do you do? What tips do you have when that's the case? How do you
bring them over? It's always the, what's the saying? It's like you win more flies with honey than salt.
I don't know.
I don't know yeah. So I try vinegar? Well, it could be vinegar. Let's say vinegar. Yeah. Doesn't sound right to me. But I mean, you try to be nice. You try to be respectful. I mean, I think when you get to the point where, not that the person becomes belligerent, but it is sidetracking the entire discussion. And you can often see it. I mean, you can see, you have this person who keeps asking questions you can see them getting agitated, and you can see people around them looking at the person being like, come on already, right? You can always,
depending on who the person
depending on who the
right?
person is, but you can often, if not always, say, these are great questions. I'm really happy to have this conversation with you, but I want to make sure that I can finish my presentation. So let's talk afterwards. I mean, I don't think there's anything. I've never had a case where I've said that and the person's like, no, I want to talk now, right? So I think it's okay to pull people aside or to say that you'll talk later, because I think people, they do want to express themselves, but they're also sort of conscious of the world around them. And I think broadening this discussion a little bit, like if you're on a panel or if you're a moderator of a panel, I think it's the moderator's job to diffuse those situations. And also, whenever I moderate, I make a point of saying, in the Q&A section, we're here for questions. We are not here for you to go on a rant and for you to make your position known. Yep. That's what our panelists are here for. This is the time for questions. So I think it's about, sugar, not vinegar, or some other thing.
We'll have to look that up after. Yeah.
It's terrible. We should know that. Yeah.
All right.
Do you want to do one more rapid fire? Do you have any more?
I do, but I'm gonna let
I got
that
one for
go.
you.
Okay.
But I know what the answer is going to be.
That's fine.
Okay.
I asked you things
All right.
knowing what the answers would be.
Okay, ready? Index cards or Post-it notes?
Oh, yeah, you know which way I'm going with that. Although, so I would clearly go Post-it notes. I like the fact that they stick. I mean, you see me.
I'm looking at your notebook
things,
right here.
I lose things.
Yep.
So my notebook in front of me, it's open, it's a spiral bound, and there are Post-it notes all over both sides.
Right.
If I were doing it on index cards, and I will say, whatever works,
use
whatever works.
Right.
But I'd have them all over. They'd be disorganized. I would feel really uncomfortable.
Right.
So for me, Post-its are how I plan everything in my life.
So I like index cards for presentations.
You like to reshuffle them. RJ Andrews uses index cards as well. And I've seen his piles of indexes.
I like to, and I'll work in multiple places. So I'll work in my home office. I'll work in the office here at Urban. So I'll, push them all together, wrap a rubber band around them, and take them with me. And you can't really do that with Post-it notes, except you have your notebook where you can sort of move around. Which is
sort of a brute forcing of the thing. Index cards, I would lose them, or things would get disorganized. And I like to be able to, for me, there's something valuable about being able to see everything at once.
Yep.
And so I spread them out.
Yeah.
So when I use Post-it notes at home, when I'm storyboarding or something, I have massive sheets of paper
that
I do it on.
I mean, don't you think we should have bought stock in 3M years ago?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I have one more. This is fun. I wasn't prepared to do this.
We should maybe do this for an entire podcast at some point.
Okay. This is really one more for my son than anything else. Okay. Storytelling with data, mints or M&Ms?
Oh, this is a tough one. I'm going to go mints.
Mints, okay.
So John knows, and his kids know, hi Jack, that, we've had some fun with branding swag, which include mints with little bar charts on them and M&Ms with little bar charts on them.
Okay.
And actually, I love the fact that the M&Ms are blue, gray, and white. I think that's a nice assortment.
Yep.
But the mints, they come in this cute little tin, and they last forever.
Yep. Jack likes to shake them, so.
All right. So, John, it has been a pleasure, as I knew it would be. Any final thoughts to leave people with?
So the answer is always yes.
The answer is
always
final thought would you leave us with today?
So I think if you are the kind of person whose job it is to work with data, which is probably 100% of your listeners, right? If it is your job to work with data, conduct analysis, conduct research, it's not enough to just write up your results and put it out in the world and hope that people are going to come to it. You need to do some work to bring people to that content. And that might be through better data visualization. It might be through better presentations. But I think it's also about the planning and the strategic phase of things, that you can't just put it out and expect people to come, that you need to think really carefully about who is the most important person I want to read this report or see this graph, right? Is it a policymaker? Is it a stakeholder? Is it a funder? Is it a colleague? And I think if we can spend, we being all of us really, spend a little more time thinking more strategically about how we want to impact the world and who we think can help us do that, I think we'll all be better off, because we'll be able to better target our work to those particular people and those particular groups.
Where can people follow you?
They can follow me on Twitter, at Jon Schwabish. They can follow me on my website, policyviz.com. If they're really brave, they can follow me on Instagram, but I'll warn them that my Instagram feed is only pictures of warning signs. It's all it is.
I'm not going to even go there right now. We will link to all of those as well as all the other resources that Jon has mentioned in the show notes. If you haven't already, be sure to check out Jon's book, Better Presentations, and also the forthcoming Elevate the Debate. Thanks for joining, Jon, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks, Cole.